Boing. 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 Boing.
So
Boing.
yeah, this
Boing.
like this my new channel,
Boing.
and like it's cool.
Boing.
And
So
Boing.
yeah,
shut up!
Boing.
Shut up!
my new channel.
Boing.
Oh my goodness. So guys, I put past me in the silly place, and yeah. So this is my new channel, and like I'm gonna post here now because I'm cool and the channel is cool. So like it makes sense. What my mom yapping about? And my goodness. So yeah, I'm gonna just be like posting it here now. I got a cat, which is pretty cool because cats are cool, duh. And yeah, here's a picture of it. Yeah. Yeah, I'm just gonna be playing like random games. Yeah. Oh yeah. I'm gonna win because I'm good. How about? Oh yeah. Alright, Laura, you get. Shut up! No. Oh yeah, I'm so. I hate this one. Really.
This is the thing what you have, but what you want to click on is adjust resolution. So you have this.
Hello? Well, if you're hearing this and you made it to day 2, congrats. I won't...
Is that money? No, that's not money. Oh my goodness, bro. Stop looking at me like that, bro. Get off my face.